word. Pay is number 4. Recruitment, what was recruitment, guys? 5. Recruitment's my best friend. I know that one well. So I always like to start off, what is recruitment, or what does the payroll even ask of us, right? So it asks us to have a system of pay administration for employees, and we need to make sure it's competitive, and we need to make sure it's equitable. So that's the whole purpose of rule number 4. And some of the things that rule number 4 goes over, I like to call it kind of like the foundation. You know, in that case, an in-pay band can happen for 3 reasons. So that's our way of trying to frame it for managers and HR people to say, okay, I'm giving an in-pay band. What does it fall under? What category? And we'll go over that. So, and then we'll send out the PowerPoint after this, but I always like to include all the definitions in this payroll so you have an easy way to reference them. And then if we have time, we have a little thing called the consultant games. And it's our way of giving you a scenario, and then using the rule of pay, you tell us how you think you would solve that problem. So it's a fun game, but there's a whole objective behind it, and you guys probably deal with it every day, right? There is no right answer until you know all the facts. Are you scared? Just kidding. That's where we got it from. We were trying to be funny and didn't get that many laughs, but you guys gave me one. Okay, so we're building the house. So we're gonna start with the pay plan. The director, through the direction of the board, establishes, maintains, and administers a pay plan. I like this rule because in it also talks about that we're responsible for giving information to hiring managers on how to make decisions on pay. Most importantly, appropriate placement and being equitable. So that's where you'll find that in the rule. And I feel like that's part of this territory that we really have an opportunity to partner with you do that, right? Where are you telling me, SPO, how to do that? It also talks about compensation policies in the pay plan, and it asks that if you have them, you get them pre-approved by our office. Whenever I do this training at Brenda, I like to talk about corrections, because when we were consolidated, I got to know your compensation policy very well, and you helped me a lot with it. But they have a very, I would say, established compensation policy because of her agency, right? Because of the prisons or the facilities, they have a very structured way of pay for the people that work within the facility. So that would be an example of a policy that they got filed with us and that they follow when they are making compensation decisions. I like to bring up compensation survey and compensation report because when I first started here, you know, at the end of the year, you always hear Cliff McNary, or it was Justin Najeka giving these presentations and talking about these things. So I think sometimes if you can refer it back to why they're even doing it, it helps us kind of understand why we are here, really. And this, in the rule, the compensation survey starts talking about having to look at comparable states, private, public. They can go outside the region, the rule talks about, if they need to. And then they have to yearly give a compensation report where they include their findings on the actual survey. So they save those on our website under class and comp and reports, and they're really cool to look at. So I reference them a lot when I'm just looking to see how things have changed over time, or wanting to understand the workforce in general, how many people might be leaving, those types of things. So that's where that is. And then once we have the pay plan, then we assign pay bands. How many of you are on the job evaluation committee? So Brenda, okay, so not that many. So the rule actually talks about the job evaluation committee and says that SPO has to create some type of format to evaluate jobs. And so how we do that right now is we're using the HAY methodology, which is our way of measuring jobs. And so Brenda, if you're familiar with this, you're in a committee of 10, right? The rule says it has to be a committee of 10. And they're going over, let's just say you have a new job, right? Because new jobs don't have a pay band yet. So we just did the healthcare study. So that's a very relevant example. They had to go to this job evaluation committee, and they looked at how a job was described, and then they answered a series of questions about job size, accountability, problem solving, and then that allows them to assign it a point value, which is tied to an actual pay band. So I feel like that's really helpful to understand how that even gets to a 55 or a 65. That's how they do it. It's a total number of points. Those points have to go to the director, who reports them to the board, and that's how a job becomes a job, kind of like a bill becomes a bill. Did you see that in high school where it like tracks it? That's what it always makes me think of, because I'm like, oh, that's how that happened. We are responsible for training on the process. So if Brenda's a member, I know Lisa Fitting's a member, they had to go to our training, so they even would understand what to do. Because when I first was sat in on an evaluation committee, it's like a beautiful mind or something. It's like science or math, or I don't know, it was just strange to me. I was like, what, how are they doing this? So you have to be trained for sure in order to understand how to evaluate, give points, all that good stuff. I always like to talk about appeal because I think it's interesting in the rule. Let's just say you had a job that didn't exist and you described it and it got assigned a pay band. The rule talks about how you can, doesn't use the word appeal, but how you can revisit it if you feel like the assignment was not accurate. And it talks about the time frame. I think it says no more than once every 24 months. So if something were to happen, you have some type of recourse as an agency. So I always like to point those things out. But usually agencies are so involved in this process, it's not like a surprise when evaluation is completed. Okay, so assignment of alternative pay bands. So this section of the rule talks about that. The director recommends to the board. The reason why I said the snout, because if you ever hear Pam, that's how she describes it, right? So it basically gives you a little more leeway to compete. And alternative pay bands are given to compete for recruitment and retention. They're not given because the job size has grown. It has nothing to do with that. That's why when you go to alternative pay bands, you'll see two pay bands. You'll see the smaller one, and then you'll see the snout or the larger one. You need to know the smaller pay band exists because that's the true size of the job when they measure it. But we're giving more flexibility because we know that the market, the surrounding states, you'll never find somebody with that first pay band. So it gives you more room. It's good to know that those get approved by the board every year at the end of the year. You'll see a presentation, and I feel like it's important for you to know that's where it comes from. You're gonna have to say that then December 6th, right? At the next board meeting. Yeah, that's it. I mean, yeah, maybe I could have gotten more of a profile of the pig. Do the snout. Okay. It's an actual snout. Yeah. I know. I'll put on a mask. Just kidding. Okay, so salary schedule. So basically we're just building, right? So we talked about the pay plan. Without that pay plan, we can't establish pay bands. And then of course you have your salary schedules. Another relevant point, we just expanded them 4%, right? So the board is allowed to do that with the director, and it's all based on market, competing, all that good stuff, so that agencies have the flexibility that they need in order to hire and retain employees. This part of the rule starts talking about min and max. So this is where you get the, you can't be under the minimum of a pay band. You can't be over the maximum of a pay band. So if you get managers that are like, why? I don't understand. You know what I mean? This is where that comes from. The rule also talks though that because we just did a salary adjustment, you're gonna have people that go over the max, right? Let's just say their pay cannot be affected if they're going over the max for this reason. If somebody falls below, which is more likely, right? Below the min, when you do an adjustment, the rule says you have to bring them up to min. The rule also talks about, some of you might be in a situation or have been where you're like, well, that's great, but we have no money. There's nothing I can do to bring them to the min. So the rule also addresses that. It says that you have to submit a plan, work with SPO, and it also talks about in pay bands. So if somebody is being considered for an in pay band, it's one of the requirements that no one in your agency is below minimum of the pay band. That's where that comes from. Okay. And I also like this section of the rules, salary schedules, because that's where it says placement is identified by a Compr Ratio. So sometimes when we're talking with managers or partnering, they might be like, well, I don't care. Do you know what I mean? Just help me. So it's good to understand where it comes from, and then more importantly, where it's referenced if you get questions. But when you place somebody, they're assigned that percentage, the Compr Ratio. Okay, so you guys are pretty familiar with these things. Now we're going to get into decoration or meat. We'll say potatoes for me, because I haven't had some bread. Okay, so Compr Ratio, we're going to talk about how we use it, our 3 proficiency zones, and then appropriate placement. I also added a slide on some of the frequently asked questions that we get on appropriate placement, especially from working with agencies when we were consolidated. So, and just learning how everybody does things. So basically the Compr Ratio is pay expressed as a percentage of the midpoint of a pay band. So the midpoint is always 100%. You're smack in the middle. And basically that's just saying you're a fully rounded employee, meaning that you have education and experience to allow you to function in that job with minimal training. So that's basically just a guide for you when we're placing people. You get it by dividing the hourly salary by the midpoint of the band. I've gotten like 3 questions where people think that we don't tell them that math. Oh, I thought that was funny. So I was like, oh, we'll put it there. It's also in the rule. It tells us at what level we're contributing and the classifications we're in. So it's like the easiest way to know if someone's higher in the pay band and their Compr Ratio percentage is higher, then that tells me how they're functioning within their job. Of course, none of this in our world is always black and white, right? So there's always scenarios where it doesn't always work out that way. But at least if you have this as your guideline and framework, we can use it when we're justifying and supporting actions. So Compr Ratio is really easy to start taking apart when you consider the minimum qualifications, right? So every single job has these established benchmarks that says you can't get hired unless you have A and B. So that's our framework. That's our starting point. So if somebody just meets the minimum qualifications, then that kind of gives you a guide. Okay, well, they need to be on this more shallow end, right? If somebody exceeds the minimum qualifications, then it starts, you can start moving them up in the pay band. I always like to say that, you know, with a caveat, it doesn't always work that way, right? I just signed an action where an employee had met the min quals exactly, right? And our first pushback would be like, well, you're trying to hire this employee at 115 Compr Ratio. He just meets the min quals. That makes no sense. But our world never is like that, right? The agency was able to say, no, the 6 years that this person has is directly related to this job and will immediately add value, and they will be able to function in this way because of this, that, and the other, right? So I don't want you to think, oh, they're not going to approve it if it's not black and white, but it's just good for you to understand when you do need to justify because it doesn't meet the black and white, how you do that, right? So we're not going back and forth and then ultimately the employee or your agency is suffering because you're waiting for an answer. I always like to bring up the full performance qualifications. On almost all of the classification descriptors, they have what we call full performance, and that's basically an easy guide for you because it describes what 100% looks like. It says full performance. If the min qual is high school in 2, more than likely they up it by 2 years every time. That the mid fully functioning would be high school in 4. So that's also a guide, especially when you're justifying actions and they are pretty black and white. That's a way to get in and out. You know what I mean? To be like, here it is, it's black and white. Okay, any questions on that? Okay. All right, so then we have our 3 proficiency zones, and basically same thing. It captures a section of the whole pay band that will be able to tell you how you're functioning. The principal zone is the highest level, and that means that you're maybe adding value to your organization. So if independent zone, it's good to think of as right in the middle, minimal to no training. And then of course your first zone is heavy training, right? somebody who needs a lot of support in order to move up. One thing to consider, sometimes you're not always going to have the flexibility to say, oh, I'll move you into the independent zone in 3 months, right? So you're going to have to know your type of job, what that person brings to the table, because the rule also talks about anticipated performance if you know it. So then you might be able to say, I get that this person just meets it, but given all this support and this information, we're going to target initial pay in the independent zone because of all this, right? So those are all things that you should be able to have to justify things that don't work out perfectly. And then this just gives you the definitions that I just went over. I like the ninja. Okay, so now to me, it's like the real world, right? Making that connection. So when we say it out loud and we're like, oh, this is the way it works, and here's the min quals, and let's go, right? This should be easy. Then we have to actually look at all these other considerations. Some of the other things we have to look at is budget. That's most important, right? Because even if you think someone should be paid at a certain rate, you might not have the money for it. So the appropriate placement, actual rule I included there includes all those things. It's including education, experience, any type of training or certification, pay equity, and like I just mentioned, employee performance or anticipated performance when it's known. Those are all things you have to consider when making decisions about pay. The one that we get asked most frequently, or the ones I see we go back and forth is internal pay equity. And so we were able to see, just because we had the advantage of having to service several agencies at once, how every agency did it, right? And agencies just did it differently, and it wasn't good or bad. To me, it was more like, we're missing an opportunity, we meaning SPO, to help people do things all the same, right? We could have, that to me is a better use of our time to at least get common playing ground. So that's the one we get asked the most. So I included the internal alignment definition, but it's basically how we are trying to be equitable when we're paying and looking at like classifications, similar units, all that good stuff. That's of course black and white. You guys are our best allies because you know your agency, right? Sometimes multiple people in multiple units do the exact same thing. Sometimes, like in corrections case, they might only have one of that classification at the Springer prison, right? But they also have a like size prison that also has one of those classifications, and they like to make sure they're equitable with their facilities. So there's all different ways to look at it. So we'll talk about that a little more. So these are the common questions that I think we've gotten on internal alignment, and you can kind of give me your feedback or other questions. On the PARF, we only have 3 lines where, you know, there's 3, I don't know, boxes for people to include comparable. We have gotten so many questions, especially when we were consolidated, saying, well, we only have to include 3. There's only 3. And so I don't think the form is super intuitive, but there's like this little box with this like fine print that says, you know, what does it say? Attach if there's more. Yeah. So when you'll see in the next couple of weeks, when we show you the revised PARF, we're doing away with that section to avoid confusion, and we're trying to give more information on what we're looking for so that we're not confusing agencies and they think they only need 3. Sometimes you might have 0, many times, right? If there's no one to compare to. So we've been working closely with agencies. Diane, like you're an example at CYFD, they would include 2, right? And so Diane's team is trying really hard to kind of evolve and include everybody that should be compared, right? So she's working really hard. How's that going? Good or bad or? Well, I see on your comp forms, like when you can, so it's just baby steps, right? Because we can't just expect like turn on a light, oh, we're gonna change everything that we've been doing for 20 years. And then what does that do? If you've been basing pay on all these, on this old, or not an old, but a different methodology. So, okay, is all experience related? So we see that sometimes. So when it asks you for comparable employees, education and experience, sometimes we would see managers, when we were working directly with them, they would just include every single thing. every single job they had, right? And so obviously you guys know, no, we only include related or directly related experience. And those things aren't the same. I might have 6 years of directly related experience and you might have 10 years of related experience and I get paid more, right? Because you're able to justify why my 6 is making me function at a certain area because of what those years are in, as opposed to generic experience. That's where it gets gray. That's why you have, you know, HR as a discipline, right? Or a profession, because that's where you help hiring managers kind of decipher. I really like environments. So like Stephanie Sloman, when they submit their comp actions, like they go into it, like you're in it to win it. Like, so they describe why they're making a decision on salary. And many times they're considering directly related experience as opposed to just generic, and they have their managers decipher, and then that's how they come up with their decision. So that's very helpful for them if that information gets pulled. The one thing that I see is that that's one of people doing it many different ways. So with this revision, we're trying to say, what's the best way to do it so that we're not causing delays? Some of the things you guys are still doing is submitting letters from like your secretary, regurgitating everything that's in the PARF. So we're trying to do away with that so that it saves you time on the back end. Oh, to help them understand. I mean, I think your unit is your first line of defense, right? So if you go to your organizational listing, obviously we're assuming it's cleaned up. For the most part, I think they're okay. You would know if they're not, right? And then you're able to say, no, this person's not a comparable. They're actually being moved to this unit, you know, next week or whatever. That's your first line of defense, to be like, okay, do I see if it's a financial specialist? Do I see any other financial specialists right here? And then you always have to keep your eye on the bigger prize if you know your agency. Do I know that there's other people doing the exact same work? Are we being equitable across the board for these types of jobs? But that's really your first line of defense. Even though you might have, I just had one, an pay band for someone, forget the classification. Let's just say it was an office clerk. They had 2 office clerks in the same section. So immediately you're gonna be like, well, where's that person? But they were able to say those people do 2 different things. They're not responsible for the same thing. Oh, it was you, Yvonne. What was it? An IT, yes. There we go, not an office clerk. It was an IT manager. And I was like, wait a minute, Yvonne, where's this other person? What are they doing? And she goes, oh, well, they have 2 different jobs. They're not comparable. So that was helpful for me. What's not helpful is that our form isn't clear. So how much time did I waste having to talk to her before I could approve that in pay band, right? So that's the things that we're trying to demystify and hopefully correct as we move forward. So the new forms will have guiding questions that tell you exactly what you need in order to get this action approved. So to me, that's your justification. So I wouldn't ask you to regurgitate that again. There will be a signature line for HR. All the signatures will stay the same. Some agencies require a more in-depth level depending on what your cabinet secretary wants. Some don't, right? It just depends. Where do I find them? We just went over that. Unit is your first line of defense, and then you go bigger if you need to. Sometimes 2 units might have the exact same people in the job and you need to include both. CYFD is a good example. They have tons of social workers. They have different levels of social workers, but they're all over the place. So they try really hard to keep it to region. And sometimes you pay differently by region, right? Depending on recruitment and retention issues. Okay. So hopefully this will answer some of their questions too. The payroll goes over all of these actions. In pay band, salary upon promotion, demotion, all that good stuff. And these are the things that we're hoping that if we ask specific questions that we're not going back and forth and you're not just in your recommendation hoping you answered anything that I have in my head, right, that I'm expecting. So what we're hoping with what the form will do is, let's just say you have an in pay band and it's a drop down box, so you pick the action. So let's just say you pick in pay band, then the questions that just refer to in pay band will populate. If you pick TSI, just the questions that deal with the TSI would populate. And then of course you might have combos, like I've been seeing lately a handful of I am in pay bands with retention differentials. Sometimes they might need 20%, but you can only give 10% a fiscal year, so you're kind of giving them a band-aid. Okay, so here's an example of a question set for an action. Okay, temporary salary increase. Okay, so temporary salary increase. So if you selected that on the compensation form, these two questions would come up. List the duties that are characteristic of a job requiring greater responsibility, accountability. Basically, it's quoting the rule. Okay, so her question was about Compr Ratio and if we're gonna provide like a uniform way of calculating it. Oh yeah, are you talking about Department of Health or their spreadsheet? Or are you just talking about the percentage in general? The Department of Health? We have that. It's funny that you bring that up because when we met with our pilot group, we got resources that other agencies are using to make their lives a lot easier, especially in a digital way, to document candidates' experience in education and then keep tracking it as it moves on. So you have one database, if you will. So yeah, we're going to be sharing that information with the group when we roll out the new form. Yes. Okay, so if you selected a temporary salary increase, these two questions would come up. The second question is document how the employee's qualifications relate to the additional duties being performed. So pretty simple. Some of the things we miss for TSI is that's just it. You basically have to be doing a higher level job. You don't have to be doing all the duties, you have to be doing some of the duties, right? If you were doing all of the duties, that'd be a different action. So that's all we're asking you to do. Sometimes the job exists and sometimes it doesn't. We just did one for an agency where they're doing some type of project-based work that when compared to their existing job, the additional duties were of like a higher level manager. So we were able to document if the job existed, here's what it would be and this is how it's bigger. Do you guys ever give in pay bands or a TSI for a smaller size job? Yeah, I haven't seen one. So TSIs to me are pretty straightforward, but I want to decrease the amount of time we're going back and forth with questions that are directed to the actual action and literally from the rule. This would be, this might be hard for you guys to see, but it's, I just did two examples. So this is what you'll see for when you select in pay band. This series of questions will come up. So I talked about it at the beginning. The rule says there's basically 3 reasons why someone could get an in pay band. The first one is like the slam dunk easiest one, which one? Well, it doesn't say that. Okay, sorry. Appropriate placement. That's like easy, right? Like if somebody clearly is not paid appropriately because of what they bring to the table, those are easy, right? Those are slam dunks in my opinion. The other one's demonstrated performance. Those ones aren't, I don't want to say are not easy, but you have to justify them. You have to explain situations or things that the employee was involved in that added value to your organization. Now that added value is all relative to where they're functioning, right? So if I try to give somebody an in pay band and they're at 100%, I'm not looking for the moon and the stars, right? You have to pay attention to how they're functioning in their job to begin with. If I'm trying to give a Gen 1 an in pay band who's already at the principal zone, they're going to need to show how they're adding value to the organization within that level that they should already be functioning in. So they're not hard, but they require a different type of justification, and the manager's got to understand that. The third reason for the in pay band is like demonstrated skill or training that may have happened. So those are the 3 reasons. So if you're dealing with a manager, that's a good way to break it down. Why are we doing this? And that's what the paperwork will have them do. We'll have those reasons listed on the paperwork. Then we care about, does this action create any pay equity issues? Basically, you're going into internal alignment again. Who else does similar work? Are they paid appropriately? These last 3 bullets are directly from the rule, and they should just be a checklist for you so that you're not getting yourself or your agency in a bind. If an employee has received an IPB that year, can they still get an in pay band if they received it already in the year? Yeah. Depends on the percentage. So they're just reminders for you. Is action going over the max because the rule doesn't allow it? Are employees in the agency under the min? So those ones, when you're filling out in pay bands, will be real fast. It's just a check and balance so you know exactly what the rule is requiring for those actions. So we just went over an in pay band. So we're good. Salary upon promotion. Do you have to qualify for a salary upon promotion as far as you have to meet all the min quals? Yeah, you do, because you're literally going into that job. It's not like a TSI. and you're only doing a part of it. So if I was getting a TSI for a bigger level job and someone said, oh, well, she doesn't meet the min quals, I would say, well, she doesn't have to. She's only doing this part of the job, and here's how her experience relates to that job, and move on. So these are just the rules for a salary upon promotion. Many times you guys are handling these on your own, right? Because if you do 15%, the rule allows that. If you're going above that or below the 5, that's when we get involved. Sometimes when you have these temporary, just the way it works, right? So the good thing now is that we're not living in that same environment, so we can use the appropriate tools whenever they're necessary. Okay, salary upon reduction, up to 15%. It talks about appropriate placement. Director can approve greater, and then it talks about employee acknowledging the decrease. Sometimes I get questions about when that should happen. I've seen agencies handle it both ways, as far as like, should I do it at the same time I do the offer letter? Should I do it before the offer letter? So I think the most important thing is that an employee has to acknowledge if their pay is going down. Okay, salary upon temporary promotion, 12-month period. We already talked about meeting the minimum qualifications, and it doesn't need SPO. So this one, salary upon promotion, I might have said temporary. But if you're actually getting promoted to a job, temporary or non-temporary, you still need to meet all the quals. Okay. We talked about temporary salary increase. You do not need to meet the min quals. You do need to have relevant experience so that you can be successful at the additional duties you're taking on, though. Okay, pay differentials, recruitment and retention. So these ones we separated. Recruitment talks about critical to agency, severe recruitment issue for agency, tied to the position, not the person. It's technically not supposed to be contributing to your like para, right, or your base pay. And then it also requires agencies follow up biannually. Did I say that right? Didn't sound right. Twice a year. Okay. Sometimes we don't do as good of a job making sure we follow up, right? And what's the plan so that we're supporting agencies, because they are going to go away. Do they need? Does there need to be a class study? Does there need to be something else that's happening to help them resolve the issue? Because both the recruitment and the retention differential are just band-aids. So the rules point out in both of them that we have to work together to figure out what our long-term plan is. They both have different time frames. This one, retention's approved up to a year. Both of them are director authorized, and they don't transfer with the employee. So the retention ones, when you have to justify those in the future with the updated form, it's just pretty very specific questions. It's just 1 or 2 questions, like what does this employee do that affects the critical operations of your agency? How does that happen? And then, you know, we move forward, so that you're not like writing, or the manager's writing and you're like, well, what do they even want, right? So that's an example of that. The rest of the rule talks about overtime, callback, on call. We talked about that at the beginning. I'm not going to go over that too much. Unless, Leanne, you're kind of the guru in that. Do you want to give us a 411? Because I'd probably give you the wrong 11. Okay. Yeah, but they're good. But people refer to those rules a lot, right? Especially like Brenda, like 24-hour facilities, like those are important things, shift differential, all that good stuff. There's the components of the cash money, the the cost savings incentive award. I thought it was cool, like employees actually get money. Like if you can show how they save the agency money. I've only seen it approved once. It does say SPO and DFA issue guidelines, but I always like to call it out because I think that's cool. Okay, and these are all of our definitions that are in the actual pay rule. So I think it's easy to have them in one area once we send you this PowerPoint, so you can just reference them, make notes to them. Okay, so since we have a little bit of time, and I'm sure you want to get home, right, because of the cold weather, let's just play a couple of the consultant games. Who's excited? Yay. Okay, I'll do the second one. So an agency has a staff manager who applied for a non-manager job that's a lower pay band, do they have to lose money? Sometimes you see that. Sometimes people will apply for jobs because maybe they want less responsibility or, you know, something different. An agency called to ask if they can have both a temporary retention and a recruitment differential for the same position. Can they do it? I'm looking at Brenda. Yes, you guys have actually had that, right? It's pretty cool. So you had a scenario where you had two different issues for the same position. Okay. All right, so an agency is requesting to promote an employee into the principal zone, but you note that the employee just meets the minimum qualifications. What should you do? Okay, an agency is requesting to promote an employee into the principal zone, but you note that the employee just meets the minimum qualifications. Sometimes, I mean, depending, if you had some really specialized experience, then you might be able to justify it. Okay, ready for, let's do two more. So an agency is requesting to temporarily promote an employee, but you just noted that they don't meet the minimum qualifications. What should you do? What would you recommend? Okay, let's do one more. You could give another pay tool like a temporary salary increase where you don't have to meet the min quals, but remember, if you did that avenue, they couldn't be doing the whole job. They have to do a piece of the job that's related to what they have experience in. It makes sense. If an agency wants to pay a candidate appropriately based on their education and experience, you note that two other people doing the same job are paid lower with similar experience. What should you recommend? Yep. You guys are good at the consultant games. So there's more if you wanted to take them home and ask your family. Say, here's what I do all day, dear. Just kidding. Okay, so what is your guys' feedback based on like the direction we're going? So any type of feedback's good to us, even if it's not, even if you think we don't want to hear it, it'll help us get to like where we need to be with you guys. So, I mean, I've seen HR handle that different ways. I have seen sometimes they submit it without a signature, but the key, hopefully we'll see if this works, right, is if I'm telling you, here are the 4 things you need or the 3 things you need for this thing to get approved, and you have to tell us how this applies. And if they don't, then why not, you shouldn't even submit it. Like I would have that conversation with the managers. They redid this form based on their rules. It's going to get approved if it meets A, B, and C. So if you don't have those things, you can't submit it. That's how I would approach that. And then we want to even take it a step further. Like if this starts working, how do we rethink about how we do work? Do I even need to look at all these things? Do you get what I'm saying? Or some of them, like that's where we want to go so that we could spend more time actually thinking about long-term strategic stuff, not nickel and diming 20 actions a day. You know what I mean? So, well, I think once you actually see the form, we can go from there, but I don't think like it's a hard no, like we want to take away the recommendation. The only reason why I'm saying that is because we look at all of your actions. Almost every single one is you're writing them or you're helping the manager write them. So you're repeating it or you're saying, I agree. So like, why waste your time doing that? But let's see where we're at, right? And even if you had an addendum or an opinion, you could always still add it to a form. Do you know what I mean? But we do that all the time. Yep. Okay, guys, I hope you get home safe and stay warm.